I am 74 years old, and most mornings begin the same way, with the kettle complaining on the old stove and the sound of the radio drifting low from the corner where the dial never quite lands on the station but gets close enough for the announcer to murmur the weather, and while the water wakes up, I sit at the kitchen table that once held science projects and birthday cakes and the occasional overdue bill, tracing the nicks made by my own hands decades ago when I was building cabinets for other people's kitchens and thought the future would be a straight road. You could see from one end to the other if you just kept your head down and worked. And I tell myself that a man's life is not the sum of his aches or his bank balance or even his children's opinion of him, but something slower and harder to pin, like the way the house settles at night and remembers who has lived inside it. I retired 12 years back from the plant where I ran machines with names that sounded like men, Bridgeport Haas, and I still wake before dawn because my bones have their own alarm clock, and because my late wife, Ruth, used to say that the morning is the only time of day that doesn't lie. I pour 2 mugs out of habit, then pour one back, and I keep the second mug on the table until it cools because there was a stretch after she passed when I couldn't bear the sight of only 1 cup. And then, later there was a stretch when the empty cup stopped hurting and started feeling like a small promise kept. I live on the quiet end of a cul-de-sac where the mail comes after lunch, and the neighbor's dog has decided my front steps are part of his patrol route. And I keep the yard tidy because I was raised to believe that if you can't change the world, you can at least edge the sidewalk, and I drive an old F-150 that rattles in the doors when the wind hits it sideways on I-71, but starts every time, which is more than I can say for some friendships. And on Sundays I sit in the 5th pew on the left, because that's where Ruth and I sat, and after church I buy apples at the market even though my teeth argue with them, because Ruth used to put a bowl of Granny Smiths on the counter as if green could make a room kinder. I have good days and days when the clock moves like tar, and on the slow days I walk the aisles of the hardware store to remind myself that problems, at least the honest ones, still come in sizes and can be solved by choosing the right bit or the right screw. And sometimes an old customer recognizes me and says, "Weren't you the fellow who fixed our banister the week before Christmas?" And I nod, and we both stand a little taller because it is rare in this life to be remembered for something you did with your hands. My son, Jason, does not measure problems in eighths or quarters. He measures in followers and quarterly goals. And while I do not understand his business exactly, I know it has to do with apps and partnerships and a lot of photos where nobody looks at the person they're with because they're looking at a phone. I understand that he lives at a different altitude now, a world of catered trays and valet parking, and I try not to resent it because what else did I work for if not to put him on higher ground? When Jason was small, he could not sleep unless I ran the tap so the sink made a lake out of thin air, and I would lean on the counter in the dark listening to that cheap faucet whisper, and when he woke in the night I would carry him to the kitchen, and we would stand there together breathing the smell of dish soap and damp metal, and he would relax against my shoulder, and even now, when I wash the evening plate and the fork I prefer, I hear the old faucet, and I think of the way his head was heavy with trust, and I remember believing that fatherhood was a simple equation. You do the work, you show up, you keep your word, and out of that steady drum a son learns his own rhythm. Years later, when money was thin and the transmission fell out of the truck I used for side jobs, I sold my tools one by one and told him they were old anyway, though they were the best things I owned, and I picked up a night shift at the warehouse to cover the fee for his travel team because a coach had said scouts would be around and you never know. I stapled insulation in the winter until the itch got into my sleep. I burned my wrists on restaurant ovens when I cooked short order on weekends, and I kept telling myself this is what fathers do. They lift the floor so their kids can jump higher, and if the boy grows up and forgets, well, amnesia is part of how the world stays bearable. Back then we ate at the kitchen table, and he would leave his plate with a triangle of meatloaf untouched, and I'd insist he rinse it before he ran back to the yard, and he'd groan that dishes were stupid, and Ruth would smile in that way that meant both of us should bend a little, and I would tell him, washing up is not punishment. It is the last step of gratitude, and I meant it as a lesson about belonging, not servitude. Time rearranges old sentences, though, and lately I find that when Jason calls, less often than weather changes, but more often than never. My voice tries to sound smaller so it doesn't scare him off, and I hate myself for that little shape I take, the apologetic bend in the middle of my hello, the way I pretend not to notice when he answers me on speaker while another voice laughs beside him about something I'll never be let in on. He lives 25 minutes away in a neighborhood where the houses have names and the mailboxes look like tiny barns, and I have been there only a handful of times, because the first time I went I couldn't find the doorbell, and the neighbors' landscaping crew stared at me like I was delivering a wrong package, and when Jason finally waved me in, he kept looking over my shoulder at the entryway like the scuffs on my boots might decide to hang around, and after that I told myself the drive was long and my knees were not what they used to be, which is true enough, but not the truth. He is engaged to a woman named Brooke who can set a table the way magazines do and whose laughter lands on you like confetti, and I try not to mind that when she hugs me she smells of a department store and leaves me feeling like I have smudged her blouse, and I try not to mind that she calls me Mr. C, as if my first name has to be earned anew, and I try not to mind the sense that to them I am a story they tell about beginnings, not a person invited into the middle. People say loneliness is loud, but that's not right. It is soft. It pads around the rooms and turns the corners into rooms of their own. And it teaches you to cook in smaller portions and to hide the good memories behind chores so they don't ambush you. And yet it can be managed if you keep certain hours full and certain hours honest. I fix things for widowed neighbors for the price of a slice of pie. I volunteer to set up folding chairs for the VFW fish fry because all the old arguments there have been fought already and no one asks you to prove you still matter. And in the afternoons I take the truck to the lake and sit without fishing because I have come to understand that you can love water without asking it to give you anything. I keep a ledger in my head of the times Jason surprised me with tenderness, calling me the day after his mother's anniversary to say he drove by the cemetery and sat with her for a while, bringing me a thermos when the furnace went out one winter, and I refused to leave the house until the repairman came, texting me a photo of his first apartment with a caption that said, "We did it," which I read 5 times because the pronoun felt like a hand on my shoulder, and I try to hold those moments up to the light when the other moments come, the ones where I am reduced to a calendar reminder. I am not a saint. I have been impatient, stubborn, proud in the way men get when their hands can solve most things, but not the one that keeps them up at night. And if I made mistakes raising him, they were the kind you make while caring too much. Not the kind that come from not caring, and I would tell him that if he ever asked, though I don't expect him to. What I have learned, living long enough for the mirror to start resembling uncles you never meant to become, is that dignity is not a medal someone pins on you at the end of a parade, but a habit made of small choices. The way you speak to cashiers, the way you hold the door even when no one thanks you, the way you forgive yourself for being human without letting yourself off the hook. And because of that, I keep my shirts ironed and my boots oiled and my bills paid on time, and I do not tell lies about being fine when I am not. But I also do not bleed on people who did not cut me. I had thought, perhaps foolishly, perhaps in the stubborn optimism that fathers mistake for faith, that the bridge between Jason and me would thicken with years, that as his pace quickened, mine would slow and the 2 speeds would find a compromise. Somewhere in the middle, maybe at a kitchen sink where a faucet whispers and a father and son might stand shoulder to shoulder again. Not as master and student, but as 2 men who know what work costs and why you do it. Some days that hope keeps me company. Other days I suspect it is only a photograph I keep turning over in my pocket, the edges softening, the image blurring, and yet I still tuck the shirt tails in, still check the mailbox a second time in case I missed a card or a note, still keep a clean plate ready in the cabinet, because hospitality is easier to maintain than it is to rebuild. And if I tell you all this before I tell you about the night of my son's party, it is because stories don't begin with the fireworks. They begin with the waking hours that prepared the fuse, with a man who washed up after every meal because gratitude has a last step, with a father who kept the sink shining, not knowing how the word dishwasher would one day be turned against him. The call came on a Wednesday evening when the sky was the color of old tin and the cicadas had only just begun their rasping chorus. And when I saw Jason's name on the screen, my first thought was that perhaps something had gone wrong because he rarely calls without scheduling it in advance the way he schedules meetings, but his voice was brisk and buoyant, and he said he was planning a party. He said it the way one might say the weather would be fine that weekend, casual, unexamined, and I felt the ground of my chest shift because it had been a long while since he invited me into his world for something that was not obligatory or ceremonial. He explained it was his birthday, though not a landmark one, and that Brooke thought it would be good to open the doors, to let friends and colleagues and neighbors see how they lived. And I heard something in his tone, whether pride or defensiveness, I couldn't quite place. That made me answer too quickly, "Of course I'll be there," though he hadn't yet asked if I was free. After he hung up, I sat for a while with the phone still warm in my hand, thinking how unusual it was for him to include me without a second thought. And I told myself maybe this was a sign. Maybe the current between us was shifting. Maybe the years of silence and awkward dinners were softening into something new. The days leading up to the party carried a weight I hadn't felt since the times when Ruth would send me out to buy flowers for company, and I found myself ironing a shirt twice, pressing the collar until it sat obedient, polishing the shoes I reserve. For church, though, they pinch my toes if I stand too long, and rehearsing in my head what I might say if given the chance to raise a glass. I imagined telling him how proud I was of the man he had become, and how his success was his own doing, though I had lent my shoulders, and how a father's greatest wish is not to be remembered, but to see his child walk unafraid into the world. I wrote a few lines down on the back of an envelope, though I knew I would never read them verbatim, and I tucked it in my jacket pocket like a talisman. The truck was washed, the tank filled, and when Saturday came, I drove the 25 minutes with a heart that had not beaten so fast in years. The road ahead of me, a silver ribbon that felt for once like it led, not away, but toward. The neighborhood unfolded with manicured precision, the kind of place where grass grows as if under command and driveways gleam, and I slowed as I reached his street, noting the clusters of cars angled along the curb, the lights already spilling from wide windows, the sound of music floating into the evening like a flag. I parked farther away than I needed to, worried my old truck would look out of place among the imported cars, and I walked the last stretch carrying a bottle of wine I had chosen carefully, though I doubted anyone else would notice or care. When I reached the door, the laughter inside swelled and broke as someone opened it ahead of me, a young man in a blazer who glanced at me briefly before moving past without a nod, and I hesitated, standing on the welcome mat longer than I should, smoothing my jacket, before ringing the bell. Jason appeared, tall and glowing in a shirt that looked as if it had been pressed by a professional, and for a moment my heart leapt because he smiled and said, "Dad, you made it," though the smile did not quite reach his eyes. He stepped aside quickly to let me in, and I was carried by the current of noise into a house that smelled of perfume and expensive food, with voices overlapping in a way that made it hard to tell who was speaking to whom. I tried to steady myself by noting details, the wide staircase, the art on the walls, the bowls of hors d'oeuvres arranged like sculptures, but underneath I felt the tug of being out of place, the way one feels when wearing shoes borrowed from someone else. Jason introduced me to no one at first, his attention darting from guest to guest, and I found myself drifting toward the kitchen island, clutching the bottle of wine until a woman with a too-wide smile relieved me of it and disappeared. The evening stretched ahead uncertainly, each room full of faces I did not know, and though I told myself to be grateful simply to be included, I felt the distance like a draft under a door. I had hoped there would be a moment, however small, for the two of us to stand together, for him to lean close and ask if I was comfortable, for him to remember that beneath all the noise I was his father, the one who had carried him on, tired, shoulders, and made sure the lights never went out. But the current of the party swept him away again and again, leaving me in eddies of strangers who nodded politely and then turned back to their own conversations. I reminded myself that this was only the beginning of the night, that opportunities come in their own time, and I held on to that thought like a stone in my pocket. Yet as I stood there, overlooked and half vanished in the gleam of his world, I sensed that what was unfolding would not be the reconciliation I had imagined, but something far more bitter. the kind of memory that does not fade but etches itself deep, waiting for the hour when the laughter turns sharp and the lights, instead of welcoming, show too clearly what is broken. At first the evening tugged at me only gently, the way a coat catches on a nail you don't see, a small resistance you think you can shrug off with a polite smile and a shift of the shoulder. And I told myself to breathe, to take in the music and the glitter of glass and the cinnamon-warm smell of something roasting in the oven, to be grateful for the invitation and the chance to stand inside my son's life, instead of on the sidewalk looking through the windows. Yet every minute added a thread, too. A net I didn't realize was lowering over me, and the first thread was a plastic tumbler pressed into my hand by a young man who called me Sir, in the tone people use for valet attendants, saying the crystal was for guests circulating and the plastic was safer. And before I could answer, Brooke appeared in a dress that looked expensive and carefree at the same time, kissed the air near my cheek, told me I looked so distinguished, and with the same breath asked if I wouldn't mind standing near the kitchen island because the entryway was getting crowded and she needed flow. And I said, of course, because fathers learn early to get out of the way of flow. And I found a corner beside a bowl of olives and watched Jason perform the kind of host I suppose one becomes when your house has ceilings high enough to make laughter echo twice, admiring how easily he moved from group to group and how everyone seemed to brighten under his attention, like a plant turned toward a window, telling myself that any feeling of being sidelined was old habit, not the present moment, even as the present began to show its teeth. A colleague with a haircut sharp enough to cut paper squinted at my name tag. Brooke had stuck a tiny hello sticker on me so people wouldn't feel awkward. And he said, Mr. C, right? The legendary craftsman. Jason tells us he grew up learning grit from you. And he squeezed my shoulder as if I were a relic, then nodded toward a wobbly cocktail table and asked whether I had a minute to give it your magic. And I laughed because I thought he was joking, but Brooke overheard, clicked her tongue at the table as if it had personally offended her, and said if I could take a look that would be amazing since I was so handy, and it would save calling the vendor on Monday. And she said it with a sweetness that left me no place to set down my refusal. So I knelt in my best trousers and turned the bass until it stopped shimmying while two women in mirrored heels stepped around me discussing caterers. And when the table steadied, everyone clapped in that breezy, thoughtless way people do when a busker finishes a song they weren't really listening to. And a man with sleeve tattoos handed me his empty glass because, I think, the sight of me, crouched, there had aligned me in his mind with service and disposal. I set the glass on the counter because pride is a fragile thing, and I could feel mine slipping its grip. And I drifted toward the sliding doors for air, only to be intercepted by Jason with his bright host smile, his arm grazing mine without quite resting there, saying, Dad, feeling good, right? Can you do me a favor and check if there's more ice in the garage fridge? We're running low on rocks and the guys from the firm just arrived. And I told him, yes, though. I wanted to say, tell me first how you are. Tell me you're happy. Tell me this house feels like a home and not a showroom. But he had already pivoted, and I walked through a hallway that smelled of new paint and lemon cleaner, past a mudroom with cubbies labeled in a neat hand to a refrigerator that held more brands of water than I knew existed, and I loaded a sack of ice on my shoulder the way I used to carry drywall, the cold burning my skin, and returned to the kitchen where a young woman in black, the kind of staff who moved like shadows, mistook me for another shadow and whispered that the recycling needed to go out before the bins overflowed, and I opened my mouth to correct her and then closed it again because perhaps this is what belonging had become, doing the jobs that keep the whole show moving while the show moves on without you. When I tried to rejoin the party proper, I kept running into small fences no one else seemed to notice, a conversation that tightened when I stepped near, the polite smile that said my story had reached its time limit, the man who told me he admired old-school work ethic, and then asked if it was true that people like me felt threatened by automation, and I said, people like me were too tired to feel threatened. We just kept going until the job was done, and he laughed as if I'd made a joke and looked over my shoulder for someone shinier. I had brought Jason a gift wrapped in brown paper because I have always believed wood and linen and paper say more about care than lacquer and ribbon. Ribbon. A cutting board I made from maple and walnut with a groove for the juices, sanded so smooth a fingertip could skate across it, and when there was a lull I took it from the coat closet where I'd stashed it and found my son by the bar, and I told him I'd made something for him that would last longer than a bottle, that it was a piece of the tree in the yard where he'd climbed when he was small, and his eyes softened for half a second, and then someone tapped his shoulder and said the investors had arrived, and he handed the package to a passing shadow with a quick, "Put this somewhere." Safe. And later, when I circled back through the kitchen to wash my hands of olive oil, I saw the board unwrapped and slid under a wobbling punch bowl to level it, its oiled grains swallowing a ring of condensation like a second bruise, and for a moment I had to grip the sink to steady myself, because it is a strange thing to watch your offering turned into a shim. Jason mounted a little step and rang a spoon against a glass for attention, and I thought, here is my moment. Here is where he will look toward the corner and catch my eye and say, "A man doesn't stand here alone. He stands on shoulders that still ache." But his toast floated in a language I know but do not speak, all about teams and resilience and the grind that entrepreneurs love to claim as if they invented sweat. And when he said he came from nothing, the room cheered, and he laughed and added, "Well, not nothing. My mom made sure I never starved, and you're still." And the room awed, and then he said, "And my dad, he's here tonight." And heads turned, and for a breath hope rose like a hand. He's the kind of guy who can fix anything with a screwdriver and some tape. And there was affectionate laughter, and he moved on to thank his mentors by name and his fiancée for curating their life. And the spoon kissed the glass one last time, and the little stage dissolved back into chatter. And I stood there with the taste of copper in my mouth, because I had just been erased and repackaged in a single sentence as the mascot of elbow grease. After the toast, a neighbor with a tan that looked earned elsewhere clapped me on the back and said, "You must be proud. The American ladder is still climbable, huh?" And then asked whether I'd be willing to look at his deck next week, because the boards were cupping, cash preferred, and before I could think what to say, Brooke glided in to rescue him from me, or me from him. I couldn't tell which, and she said, bright and brittle, that tonight was not for logistics, tonight was for celebration. But since I was already in the kitchen area, could I help the caterer by opening a few more folding chairs in the den, just until the late arrivals thinned? And I said yes, because the only thing worse than being useful in the wrong way is being useless completely. And while I unfolded chairs in a room lit like a photograph, I heard my son's voice through the archway say to someone I couldn't see, "Dad's fine, this is his speed, he likes having a job." And it took me a heartbeat to realize those words were meant to be kind, that in his mind he was accommodating me, a man made comfortable by tasks. And I felt the old faucet in my chest turn on, the one that used to calm crying, except now the sound made me want to walk out the door and keep walking until the music faded. I tried once more to find that small place beside him, caught his sleeve as he passed, and said, maybe toward the end I could say a word, just a minute, nothing grand. And he paused with that distracted patience successful people use like a napkin, and said, "Let's see how timing goes, Dad. People get antsy with too many speeches." And he smiled as if we'd shared a joke, and I let go because it is embarrassing to hold a man who is halfway gone. And when I looked down, I realized I was holding 3 empty glasses, not mine. Someone had set them in my hands without asking, and I was already turning toward the sink, already moving along the groove the night had cut for me. And the party swelled and glittered and made its own weather, and somewhere inside that weather something hard and old in me began to crack, not with drama, not with a shout, but with the small sound a board makes when a hidden knot finally gives. It happened so gradually that at first I didn't understand what was being asked of me, because one of the caterers brushed past with a tray and murmured something about dishes, and then Brooke appeared with that bright party smile that hides its edges, and she said, "Dad, would you mind just helping us out for a bit? The kitchen is backed up." And before I could ask what exactly she meant, Jason swept in behind her, draping an arm around her waist as if sealing the request. And he said it in a tone that was half joke, half command. "Yeah, Dad can handle it. He's the dishwasher pro." And he winked to a cluster of guests who laughed as though it was an anecdote they'd been waiting for. And then they all drifted back to their cocktails and their talk about investments. I stood for a moment, not moving, holding the 3 empty glasses someone had shoved into my hands. And then I heard the scrape of plates piling on the counter, the clatter of silverware, the gush of the faucet, and I realized they meant for me to do it not as a one-off favor, not as a small gesture, but as a task to keep me out of the way. I should have refused, I know that now, but in the moment I told myself that perhaps it was a chance to be useful, to give something to the night beyond my quiet presence. And so I stepped toward the sink, set down the glasses, rolled up my sleeves, and began. The sink was a deep farmhouse style, gleaming white porcelain, and it was already heaped with plates rimmed with sauce, glasses smudged with fingerprints, forks that still smelled of garlic. And as I turned on the water and felt the spray warm, against my hands, a strange memory overtook me of all those nights years ago when Ruth and I would wash side by side, her drying, me scrubbing, Jason running through the house with homework half done, and for a few seconds it was almost comforting, as if the house were lending me back a version of myself I had not seen in decades. But then the laughter from the other room surged, and I caught sight of my reflection in the dark window above the sink. An old man bent over plates at a party he had been invited to as a guest, and the comfort turned bitter. A group of younger guests drifted into the kitchen, drinks in hand, and when they saw me at the sink, one of them chuckled, whispering loudly enough for me to hear, "Man, Jason really puts his dad to work," and another snapped a photo with the little burst of a phone camera light, and though I pretended not to notice, I heard the shutter sound and the quick snort of laughter as they walked away. Each plate I washed felt heavier than the last, not because of the grease or the scraps clinging to it, but because of the eyes that occasionally landed on me, curious, amused, dismissive, as if I were not a father, but a prop. After half an hour, my shoulders ached and my palms had gone red from the heat of the water, and still the pile did not shrink because every time I cleared a layer, another tray of glasses appeared, and I realized this was not a short errand, but an assignment. Jason passed through once, lifted his drink toward me in a mock salute, and said, "Look at that. Still the hardest worker in the room." And the group around him laughed as though it were a well-rehearsed line, and then they moved on without waiting for my reply. Something inside me shifted then, a slow twist like the turn of a screw, because I understood with terrible clarity that I was not being asked to help, but being displayed, that my labor was being used as a kind of entertainment, a story Jason could tell later about his old man who still loved the sink. My chest tightened, not with anger yet, but with a deep, cutting humiliation that seemed to slice through the years of sacrifice and land squarely in the present. And for a moment I nearly dropped the plate I was holding because my hands had begun to tremble. I set it down, dried them quickly on a towel, and stepped back from the sink. But before I could leave, one of the caterers rushed in, saw me standing there, and said with relief, "Oh, thank goodness, you've got it handled," and then hurried out again, leaving me no room to deny it. I stayed, rooted, ashamed of my own obedience, and when another guest wandered in and saw me rinsing glasses, he raised his phone and recorded a short video saying, "Jason, man, your dad's keeping it real in here," and then posted it to some platform, because a moment later I heard laughter ripple from another room where people were already watching. I told myself to stop, to put down the towel, to walk out with what dignity I had left. But dignity is hard to locate once you've let someone else define it for you. And I kept scrubbing, as though if I finished the pile I could earn back a seat among the guests. When Jason finally returned, arm around Brooke, he peered at the dishes and said loudly, "See, folks, this is where I get it from. Work ethic in the blood." And the phrase stung worse than a slap, because I had spent my life believing work ethic was a gift I gave him freely, not a chain he would someday wrap around me. Everyone laughed. Brooke kissed his cheek, and I stood there in the suds realizing I had become part of the entertainment, not the family. By then the humiliation had hardened into something else, a heavy stone in my chest, and as I rinsed another plate, I understood that a line had been crossed, a line that could not be uncrossed, and that what had been wounded in me was not only pride, but the very bond between father and son. It was then that the night turned, the middle point from which everything would darken, because I no longer believed there was a chance for soft reconciliation. I knew that whatever happened next, the truth of who we had become to each other had been laid bare in soapsuds and laughter. And though I kept my silence inside me, a vow was forming, quiet but unyielding, that I would not leave the house without answering this humiliation in a way that could not be forgotten. I don't know when the towel became a flag I couldn't stop waving, but somewhere between the fourth tray of lipstick-ringed flutes and the seventh stack of plates that smelled like rosemary and money, Brooke slid in beside me with that radiant, event planner smile that never touched her eyes and looped a black apron over my neck as if it were a medal, tightening the strings with brisk fingers while she told the room, not me, that this was so perfect because Dad absolutely thrives when... There's a task. And before I could answer, she pressed a strip of masking tape onto the apron bib and wrote in a neat schoolteacher hand, "Kitchen Crew," adding a little heart, and the heart made my scalp prickle, because it was the kind of sweetness people used to dull the blade, and, as if on cue, a circle of laughing men drifted past, and one of them read it out loud. "Kitchen Crew, love it. That's brand alignment." And the other raised his phone for a boomerang of my hands in the suds, while Jason, coming through with the looseness of a man, applauded in every room, saw the apron, and grinned and said, "There he is, the dishwasher-in-chief," the phrase landing lightly in his mouth like a ping-pong ball and rolling, harmless to him, around the floor until people kicked it back and forth for sport. I told myself to swallow it for one more minute and then leave the sink to someone actually being paid, but the minute kept lengthening because each time I edged away a new tray arrived, or a caterer with exhausted eyes mouthed "thank you" at me, as if I were a volunteer firefighter, or a guest deposited an empty with the soft pat that is half gratitude and half dismissal, and then a woman in a dress with mirrored sequins snapped her fingers near my ear, playful, but not to me, and asked if I could handle a quick rinse on a lipstick stain because she didn't want it on her hands, and I had the absurd thought that all evening I'd been washing proof of other people's mouths while mine had been asked only to smile. When I finally dared shut off the water long enough to dry my palms, the kitchen TV, a high-gloss panel tucked under a row of cookbooks chosen for their spines, flickered with a story someone had cast from their phone, a 30-second video titled POV, "The Dishwasher is My Dad." And there I was, hunched and dutiful and red-handed, sped up to make the soap fly comical, and there were already hearts and cry-laughs floating across my own face, and the caption's little dagger lodged deeper, not because strangers were amused, but because my son's friends were, and because the small boy who once fell asleep to the sound of that faucet would have died before feeding me to a room for a laugh. I thought if I could find Jason alone, I might pull him back to me for a breath and ask him to see me as I was, not as the mascot the night had appointed, but as I stepped into the butler's pantry, I pulled up short because their voices were all ready. There, low and urgent, Jason's pitched in that half-confidential tone he uses for deals, Brooke's crisp and efficient, and they were not speaking about me as a person, but as a variable, one to be managed and leveraged, Brooke saying that structure was good for him, and this, frankly, was the calmest she'd seen me in ages. And if they could just get the capacity letter signed, the Maple Ridge spot would still be open, because her cousin at the clinic could expedite the language. And Jason, not even lowering his voice, saying he'd talked to someone on Wednesday about the durable power of attorney template, and all they needed was my signature under the witnesses, which could be handled at a family brunch, if they framed it as insurance, and Brooke adding that once that was in place, refinancing my house would be painless. We'll call it consolidating obligations. Banks eat that up. And then they both laughed softly at something I didn't catch. And the sound of their laughter in that little pantry where Ruth and I would have kept tea and jam made the room tilt. I backed away before my feet could betray me and leaned against the cool edge of the freezer, my breath slow as if I were surfacing from a deep dive. And I looked at my wet hands and understood the shape of the evening in a new, colder light. The apron wasn't just a joke, it was a rehearsal for the role they had written for me. A man safely contained in a service corner, smiling, helpful, pliant, an old radiator that still worked if you kicked it, and they were telling each other that this was kindness, that structure is love, that paperwork is prudence, and that the father who built their ladders would be most comfortable stored under one. When I returned to the kitchen, my gift was lying belly up under the bar, my maple and walnut board, the one I had oiled the night before, as if it were an altar, wedged under a sloshing punch bowl to stop its wobble, its grains scored by someone's serrated knife where they'd hacked at limes, and for a second I put my palm flat on it, the way you might touch the lid on a coffin, remembering the day I planned that board's parent tree after a storm had taken a limb, and little Jason traced the rings, asking, "Which one was the summer we went to the lake, and I wanted to pull the board out and rescue it the way you want to lift an insult back off your name?" But the punch bowl quivered as if daring me to try, and a woman with a camera said, "Don't move. Light is perfect." And it was easier to leave the sacrilege where it lay and return to the faucet where at least the rules were simple. Not 5 minutes later, someone pressed a folded bill into my damp hand with the quick, embarrassed flourish of a man tipping a valet. And before I could give it back, he was gone, and I was left with the 20 in my fist, as if I had earned it, as if my family had hired me for the night, and I tucked it into the apron pocket not to keep it, but to keep from throwing it, and the ridiculous weight of that paper against my hip fueled a slow fire I had not felt in years. The room, sensing perhaps that the roast portion of the evening demanded fresh meat, swiveled on its axis toward the living room where Jason stood on the little step again, this time with a microphone, and Brooke at his elbow like a stage manager. And he said they'd do a few toasts, keep them tight, and a friend of his with a haircut like a geometry problem began the roast by praising Jason's rise from nothing to this. And I waited for the correction, the gesture toward the men and women, who had made sure nothing never meant hunger or dark, but it didn't come. Instead, the friend swung toward me with a grin and said he'd discovered tonight where Jason's grit came from. Apparently being born into a house with a live-in dishwasher was good training, and the laughter came easy and long, and when Jason took the mic again, he came right up to the kitchen threshold and held it toward me like a charity basket, saying, "Dad, you want to say a word? Maybe tell the crowd your secret to streak-free glass?" And he meant to be charming, and I meant to be kind, but the only secret I carried in that moment was the one he had just betrayed to me in the pantry, and I shook my head not because I had nothing to say, but because what I had to say was too heavy to place in their hands yet. The roast continued with a woman from Brooke's side telling the gathered that dating Jason had taught her, "Not all baggage comes with wheels." A little arrow launched with a smile, and then the neighbor, tan and easy, raising his glass to parents who know when to get out of the way. And through it all, the screen in the kitchen kept blooming with new notifications as the video of me at the sink skittered across phones, now captioned with stickers of bubbles and tiny crowns, and someone, meaning it is a kindness, settled a paper party crown on my head that said King of Suds in gold marker, and I left it there because removing it would have felt like making a scene, and I was not going to give them that kind of excuse. When a late guest wandered in and, seeing the apron and crown and the hum around the sink, asked if staff were allowed to take breaks, I opened my mouth to tell him I didn't work here and could leave any time. But across the archway I caught Jason, telling a pair of men in suits that Dad likes tasks, structure works for him, and the words slid into me like ice because they were the same ones from the pantry, now softened with a son's smile for public consumption. And I understood that in his mind and in Brooke's neatly ordered universe, my obedience had become a personality trait, a preference, like a favorite flavor or a hobby. And that was the second blow of the night, as clean as a hammer on a nail. Not only could I be used, I could be explained. A small mercy arrived in the form of an older man I didn't know who took a towel without a word and began to dry, his hands as careful with stemware as a medic with glass, and for a few minutes we worked in a quiet that felt almost human, and he murmured, not looking up, that his father had been a carpenter and would have hated this sort of party. And I said mine too, and he put the towel down and patted my arm with the tenderness strangers sometimes manage when family cannot. And then he was gone, and the current flooded back in, washing over the island with the froth of more laughter, more clinking, more performance. Somewhere behind me a tip jar appeared on the counter with a tidy card reading "Staff Gratuities," which would have been a kindness to the people actually employed tonight, if not for the fact that someone had tucked it close to my elbow, and a boy, hardly older than the age Jason had been when he climbed that maple, dropped in 2 singles and said, "For the king," and the bills fluttered like small insults. And I stared at them long enough to memorize their serial numbers, because memory, when we're stripped of honor, starts to collect the useless exactitudes that keep a man sane. In the coat room, when I finally slipped away to breathe air that hadn't been filtered by 1,000 mouths, I reached into my jacket to touch the envelope of sentences I'd written on the back of a utility bill, talisman against nerves, and my fingers found only damp pulp. Someone had set a sweating bottle on the stack, and the ink had bled into blue islands, and I stood with that limp paper like a boy whose prize had melted before the fair, feeling a heat rush to my face that had nothing to do with the kitchen. I might have walked out then, taken my washed hands and my ragged pride in my truck, and left the whole glittering aquarium to its own currents. But as I stood there, I heard Jason's voice carry down the hall, "Okay, last one, then cake." And there was a tremor under it, a swell like the one before a wave breaks, and I knew that if I left now the story would harden in their mouths and phones into something permanent. The cute video, the roast, the helpful dad who loves a task. I went back to the sink not because I accepted the role, but because that was where the hinge now sat. The night had placed me there, and it was from that station I would either be humiliated into silence or step out into the doorway and choose my own volume. The second escalation arrived on time, like a train you hear long before you see, because after the final toast, another tidy erasure of my name in a list of thanks to mentors and chosen family, Jason hopped down and, with that same showmanese, clapped his hands for attention and announced a game that Brooke had curated, a little trivia about him with a prize for the winner, and as people called out answers about his first car, his favorite bourbon, his startup's first office, Brooke turned toward the kitchen and shouted, playful and bright, "Bonus point if you know who taught him the meaning of hard work." And a dozen voices answered at once, "His mom," and a few jokers added, "Gary V," and one or two pointed toward me and said, "The dishwasher," and Brooke, eyes glittering, gave the point to the crowd. And I felt something old and animal rise in me, the same thing that had stood between my son and a fever in the small hours of a winter long gone, and I understood with a clarity that steadied my hands that they were not only comfortable with my service, they were comfortable with my erasure, and that this, not the faucet or the apron or even the power of attorney talk, was the deepest offense. I rinsed the last glass in the stack and set it on the drying mat with deliberate care, each movement its own small, private liturgy, and as I turned off the water the room seemed to sharpen, each voice suddenly distinct, Brooke's bright string of pearls of enthusiasm, Jason's laugh pitched just a note too high, the investor's smooth hum, the neighbor's approving buzz, the caterer's quiet choreography, and underneath it all the thrum of a hurt that had found its shape and, finding it, had stopped wandering and begun to point. I dried my hands on the apron, peeled the masking tape hard off the bib, and folded it in half until the ink bled through, and I slipped the 20 from my pocket and tucked it into the real tip jar with a note to the staff that read simply, "Thank you," and then I lifted the crown from my head and set it neatly on the edge of the sink as if crowning the faucet itself. And I picked up the board from under the punch bowl despite the wobble and the protesting shriek of glass on wood, held it by its scarred edges like a shield, and I stepped out of the kitchen toward the sound of my son's voice. I was not yet the man who would speak in the next breath. I was still the man who has learned too well how to be polite in rooms that mistake politeness for consent. But the vow I had made at the midpoint of the night had hardened into something with weight, and the second escalation, with its apron and its paperwork and its crowns and its captions and its little erasures dressed as jokes, had done its work. There is a moment when a board under strain stops creaking and splits cleanly along the grain, and everyone in the room hears it whether they know wood or not, and I felt that line run through me from shoulder to heel as I crossed the threshold, not yet speaking, not yet raising the board where a microphone would be, but ready at last to do the one task no one had asked of me, to set the table for an honest reckoning and serve my son his own shame, plated on the truth he had forgotten I could still carry. I stepped into the doorway with the cutting board held to my chest like a slow, square drum, and the room kept chattering for a heartbeat, because people in bright rooms rarely imagine they are about to be asked to listen. And then I rapped the edge of the board gently with a fork the way Jason had just done with his glass, and when a few heads turned and the music didn't, I reached over and clicked the little knob on the speaker until the coil of sound drew back into itself, and I said I would like 2 minutes, no more, and I will give them back to you if I waste them. And I felt the weight of my wet cuffs cooling against my wrists, and the old steadiness that had kept roofs straight and stairs true returned to my voice, so that even the investors who had been leaning toward the bar leaned instead toward me. I said that when my boy was small, he could only fall asleep to the sound of running water, and so I learned to make a kitchen faucet sing like a river through a cheap rental night after night until the fever broke, and that some sounds brand a house. With love, and some sounds, even if they are the same notes, are used later to drown out what a man does not want to see, and I looked at Jason not unkindly but without the crutch of a smile, and told him that if he wanted to make a show of my hands, he ought to also make a show of what these hands have done. So here is the ledger. Since the room likes numbers, 40 years at machines that shake your bones loose if you don't respect them. 3 winters hanging insulation that got into my sleep. 2 summers cooking eggs at midnight to keep the lights on. A second mortgage. The year tuition came due, and a coach promised the future liked boys who traveled. A pawned set of chisels. The month your first business misfired because you thought a handshake could cover the gap between a promise and an invoice, and a quiet envelope slid under your door the night your landlord taped that ugly paper up because a man can learn hard lessons about the market without being humiliated in front of his neighbors. I told him that the board I was holding came out of the maple he climbed when he was 7, and I cut it long ago, because I wanted him to have something that would outlast fashion and bandwidth. A surface that could take a knife and still be beautiful, but tonight it had been shoved under a punch bowl to stop its wobble, and I knew what that felt like, because all evening I had been used to steady a party that could not stand up straight on its own. And I set the board down on the island, like a tray, and said, if this is a night for serving, let me serve what belongs to you. I said to the room that I do not mind washing dishes because it is the last step of gratitude. But gratitude is not what happened here tonight, and if anyone wanted a souvenir, they could keep their videos but at least fix the caption, because it isn't POV the dishwasher as my dad, it is POV a man who paid for your windows is being used to polish them, and if that sounded sharp it was because truth, when it has been soaked too long, comes out wrinkled and stings when you wring it. And then I turned to Brooke because I am old, but I am not deaf, and I repeated, carefully, the words I had just heard in the pantry where the jams would be if this were a home. Maple Ridge spot open if the cousin at the clinic can expedite the language. Durable power of attorney template signed at a family brunch. Consolidate the old man's house as obligations. And a few smiles spreading on the words like butter, because to people who live by calendar and leverage, everything looks like a process. And I told her plain that there will be no Sunday signatures and no brunch, that my handwriting is not a faucet to be turned on when the mortgage gets thirsty, and that if she ever again puts a mask of kindness on a plan to cage me, I will teach the mask and the plan, the difference between quiet and consent. There was a movement in the air then, not loud but real, the way a field shifts when a wind finally tells the stalks what direction it is going, and Jason's laugh came out of him one note too high, the note people use when they want the room to unhear what it has already heard, and he said, "Come on, Dad, We're just teasing and keeping you busy because you like to be useful, and I told him I like to be useful in the way a beam is useful, not in the way a prop is. And there is a difference. A man forgets when the applause gets thicker than the truth. I said, if you want a toast, let me give you one more accurate than the ones tied with ribbons. Here is to the staff whose work holds up your stories. Here is to the washers and lifters and sweepers and drivers whose names you don't learn because you think their usefulness is their name. Here is to every father in this room or buried beneath it who kept his mouth shut while he shouldered 2 jobs so that his children could one day learn how to pretend that they did it alone. And if that makes your drink bitter, then perhaps your drink needed more salt. Jason told me to stop, that I was making a scene, and I said the scene was made the moment a son decided a father's labor would be funnier than his presence. And since you like truth-plated and past, here is the course you ordered, because I am going to hand you your own words so you can taste them without the garnish. You told your friends that I like tests because structure works for him. And you told your fiancé that a document giving you my decisions could be slipped between omelet and pancakes because it would be cleaner. And you told 3 men in suits that you came from nothing and learned grit from being born with a live-in dishwasher. And I am standing here to tell you that the only nothing you came from was the habit of saying thank you. And that grit is not a brand or a keynote slide, but the way a man keeps his promise when no one is filming. I said there is a kind of shame that you buy for yourself when you trade kindness for clout. And it is not the dramatic kind that explodes in a headline. It is the slow, domestic kind that stains the inside of a man until he cannot put his head on a pillow without hearing a sink he has repurposed as a drum. And because I have washed more plates than you have eaten off of, I know what is mine to carry and what is yours. So take this back tonight, not as revenge, but as inventory. The video you posted is staying up because I want you to see it in the morning when your phone tells you it did numbers. I want you to look at my red hands and ask yourself why the crown on my head looked so natural to you. And when your investors call to tell you, the roast went a little cold after the old man spoke, you can tell them yes, and now the room knows I didn't grow alone either. I slid the apron strings out from my waist and laid the fabric flat on the board because tools deserve respect, and even a misused apron is a tool. And I told the staff the tip jar at my elbow was theirs, and the first bill in it was mine, because some. Gratefulness still runs clear in this house, even if it had to come out of a different tap. And I said to Jason that I was not angry in the way a man is angry when his team loses. I was finished in the way a man is finished when a job has been done. Badly too many days in a row, and the foreman still thinks the problem is the light. Then I gave him the last thing I had to give that wouldn't hurt me to lose, which was the story his mother and I used to tell ourselves when the rent and the flu and the winter and the overtime all showed up at once, the one that made those years. Bearable, I told him that back then we believed work would teach him not how to win rooms, but how to hold them gently. That generosity would be his first language, that he would see dishwater and think not of status, but of thanks, and that if somehow I had taught him something else with my silence, I was speaking now to correct the lesson, and I stepped down from the little riser because a man should not be taller than his truth at the moment he hands it over, and I left the board on the island, with the apron folded on top like a flag recovered and the paper crown beside it like a child's toy no one had the heart to throw away. And I told Brooke, as she reached for Jason's arm, that the maples and the brunch and the papers would not be happening, and that if anybody called me confused after tonight, they should add one word to the chart, unwilling. The room had gone very quiet by then, in the way rooms do when an uninvited kind of honesty sits down among the glassware, and I heard the caterer nearest me sniff and turn away to hide it, and I heard someone else put a phone down softly, because there are some things people don't want their devices to be guilty of, and I handed the microphone back to the same hand that had given it to me. Careful as you hand a tool back to a man who does not yet know how to use it. And I said, I'll see myself out, because I still know where doors are, and I walked past the sink that was finally empty, past the punch bowl, now tilting without my board, past the staircase and the art and the shoes that had not been meant for work, and I felt with each step the particular quiet that follows a job that needed doing and has at last been done. I drove home with the windows down because I needed air that hadn't been measured and perfumed, and because the night has a way of telling the truth in a tone you can stand. And when I let myself into my kitchen, the house received me with the small sounds I know, the tick of the wall clock, the low complaint of the kettle as it begins, the faint thud of the refrigerator settling on its haunches. And I washed my hands in my own sink and watched the pink fade from my palms until they were only hands again, not content, not metaphor, just the tools that have carried me this far. And I poured 2 mugs out of habit, setting one to cool for Ruth because some promises deliver their comfort even when no one asks them to. And I sat at the table, with the envelope of words I had not needed and the quiet that follows a job that hurt to do but needed doing, and I felt something unclench that I had been holding for years without admitting it, a slow loosening like a knot that has been wet a long time. The phone began its little dance on the counter an hour later, first Jason, then a number I didn't know with a photo of the crown and a question mark, then Brooke, then the older man who had dried glasses beside me, who wrote only that I had said what. A few of us were trying to remember, and that the staff had split the jar and left a slice of cake for me by the service gate, because a man should not finish a hard day without something sweet. I let Jason's calls roll into the dark, because there is a difference between talking and being ready to hear. And I answered the older man with a thank you that felt like a hand clasp, and I slept in the chair until dawn with the window cracked and the faucet's memory filling the room like a river too far away to trouble anyone. Morning brought the clatter of the world, messages from 2 guests who apologized without excuses, and one who tried a joke and then retreated into silence when I didn't catch it. A long text from Jason that began with, "How could you?" and bent itself, mid-sentence, into a plea that we handle this privately and that I had made him look like a stranger in his own home, which I did not argue with because sometimes a sentence tells on itself, and a shorter note from Brooke, full of words like boundaries and optics and narrative that read like a press release for a family that had misplaced its noun. I wrote one answer, long enough to be clear and short enough to leave standing room, that said, "I love my son, and I would not sign anything. For anyone who thought my usefulness was a lever, that I would not be returning to that house, and that when and if he wanted to speak with me as a man, without an audience or a plan, I would be on my porch most evenings, and then I set the phone face down and went about the work of the day because the body needs the mercy of motion. At noon there was a knock, and on the stoop stood the young caterer with tired eyes, holding my cutting board in a brown paper bag as reverently as if it were a borrowed book, and she said she thought it was mine because no one in that house seemed to know where it came from, and she had wiped the limes off, but the scars would need a steadier hand. And I told her that scars could be sanded and oiled into memory, and she smiled like someone who understood that sentence from a different angle. When she left, I set the board on sawhorses and took out my sandpaper and moved with the grain until the ring marks softened and the groove for the juices shone again. And I oiled it with the same patience I used to use on Saturday boots, watching the wood drink what it needed, then set it near the open window to cure while the lake wind moved through the room and the smell of lemon oil braided with coffee in a way that made the kitchen feel like a place where life for once was not performing. In the days that followed, I did the unglamorous things that keep a man's future from being managed by other people's calendared confidence. I visited my lawyer and rewrote the papers so that decisions about me rest with a neighbor who has carried flags at funerals, and with the church secretary who has never once lost a casserole list. I amended my will so that the little I have, house, truck, accounts, tools, passes into a trust in Ruth's name that will buy jackets and textbooks and steel-toed, boots for kids who choose the trades, and I wrote a separate letter to Jason and placed it with the documents, telling him that love remains, that the door of my life is not locked, and that the key is not an apology scripted for optics, but a different way of seeing, one in which gratitude is not a caption, and work is not a costume, and fathers are not used as props to hold a room level. I gave the lawyer permission to show him the letter only if he asked gently. There were ripples I did not cause and could not control, The video boomed and then turned, as such things do, the comments first playful and then puzzled and then pointed. And a week later, a mutual acquaintance told me the investors had advised A, pause on performative content because markets dislike avoidable noise, and someone forwarded me a newsletter that admired my speech, as if I had delivered a keynote rather than a father's plain ledger, which I did not read because it is dangerous to bintontotidu. Inhale praise when what you need is air. I kept my evenings the way I had before, sweeping the porch, seeing to the azaleas, taking the truck for a circling drive at dusk, and twice, just at that blue hour when the day is both leaving and staying, a car slowed near my house and then went on, and once I thought it was Jason, but the shape of the driver's shoulders wasn't his, and I told myself that time should be given the job it does best, which is to turn hot things tolerable. On Sunday, the older man from the party found me after the service and pressed a business card into my palm with an address of a vocational program scrawled on the back and said, "If you want to put Ruth's name on something that teaches hands, these are the kids." And later that afternoon, I drove over and watched for an hour as teenagers planed rough pine into something that looked willing. And a teacher with a gentle voice told me they named their scholarships after verbs rather than people: build, repair, carry, hold. And I said if they would take my check, I would like to fund one called Keep, because the trick is not acquiring, but caring for what you already have. And he nodded in a way that let me know I had said a true thing. A month passed before Jason stood on my porch, not announced by a text or softened by Brooke, just my boy, older and thinner around the eyes, holding nothing in his hands. And we sat without talking until the light found the rim of his shoe, and he told me he hadn't known how to stop the room from treating me like a story they could post, and that he had been proud and then ashamed and then afraid. And I said fear is what comes after shame when you are not used to it, and that he could start small by listening more than he defended. And we stayed in the soft air until the kettle began to murmur through the screen, and I rose to pour us both a cup because some habits are bridges and not cages. I do not pretend the world has turned tidy. I am not writing from a place where every wound has vanished and every apology has found its proper weight. But the house holds steady again, the board on the counter is ready for bread, the faucet sings. When I ask it to and not when I am told, the trust papers are signed and stored where prying hands cannot expedite the language, and in the mornings I trace the old nicks in the table and feel not the ache of erasure, but the quiet of return, a man who washed what needed washing and then put the towel down, a father who served his son, not revenge, but inventory, and left the rest to time, which, like water, wears a groove that looks like grace only after you've survived its first cold touch.